This is a presentation about Auto Cinemanhatta. It's a speculative investigation of remix, emergence, and recreative practice. What I'm going to do today is walk through a chain of inquiries which began with a fascination with the film Manhatta from 1921, which gave way to a serious consideration of remix, what it is, what are its origins, and where do we have room to build on the foundation it produced for us, which then gives way to a concept I've been developing, which is still real work in progress, called recreative practice, and followed by that a brief description of three projects inspired by Manhatta that embrace the ethos of recreative practice. So I'm thinking about my latest creative project, which I'm variously calling Finding Manhatta, Cinemanhatta, Auto Cinemanhatta. So the project or series of projects focuses on using the 1921 film Manhatta as the foundation for a series of experiments in digital storytelling. Manhatta is a collaboration by photographer Paul Strand and Charles Sheeler, which puts lines from Walt Whitman's poetry lauding 19th century Manhattan into juxtaposition with motion picture footage of then contemporary 1921 Manhattan. Seeing Manhatta for the first time led me to a fascination with the form of the city symphony. Other city symphonies I've enjoyed include Berlin, Symphony of a Great City from 1927, Man with a Movie Camera, 1929. So it's a kind of genre of documentary or actuality film that emerges here in the 20s, silent films that feature a collage of imagery, motion pictures, a portrait of a city. So the City Symphony exerts this unmistakable influence on my early work, my student work when I was an undergraduate. There's just these endless permutations of downtown Boston at the turn of the 21st century. Shot without pans, without zooms, this sort of static frame that seeking to articulate the dynamics of the city through striving to emulate these works that inspired me. I was trying to sort of reach for what I was receiving from them, right? And trying to find it in my own daily life. My imitative City Symphony student films drew on a cultural form that I understood and I respected, using it as a conceptual framework that guided and supported my exploration of the unfamiliar contours of film. The films that I made didn't matter much in the grand scheme of cultural production. No one knows their names. They'll never be seen by anyone else other than me, my instructor, and my class at the screening. I doubt any of them survive, and they weren't exceptionally impressive specimens of student work. However, they meant a great deal to me in my development, creative, artistic, intellectual, personal. So these derivative city symphonies were part of the process of developing my relationship to cinema through an articulation of my relationship to the world. And simultaneously, they were part of exploring my relationship to the world through cinematic expression. Creating these films, in short, was a way of orienting myself as I was living in an unfamiliar city at an uncertain time. In my practice and in my understanding of cinema, media, and culture, theoretical exploration and practical endeavor have always walked side by side. The way that I understand media is through practice, and what inspires me to produce new media is theoretical exploration. So my practice has drifted away from City Symphony and towards found footage, compilation, and remix of all sorts, usually in conjunction these days with some sort of algorithmic or generative approach to cinema. But recently, I don't know why, I began to return to the City Symphony form. I walk around with a smartphone in my pocket all day, and when something strikes me as interesting, I stop where I am and I shoot like a minute of footage in as static a composition as my hands, sometimes shaky, will allow. So my phone is cluttered now with countless iterations of Brooklyn and Manhattan circa 2022, trying to capture what? I don't know. Something of that ineffable quality that stopped me in my tracks. Something of the place I live, the way I'm part of it, and the way that it's part of me. All of this frames Manhatta in a very particular way. It's a creative work I was going to use as material and a creative work of my own as a way of understanding it and celebrating it, as well as a way of understanding our contemporary moment and re-examining now contemporary Manhattan, circa 2022, through an exploration that would juxtapose 1921 Manhattan with 2022 Manhattan, that would juxtapose Whitman and Sheeler and Strand with I don't know what yet. So what I was doing is preparing to remix Manhatta. But then, thinking further about it, it occurred to me, is Manhatta already a remix? There is the use of Whitman's 19th century verse as the cornerstone of this new creative work, and there's the juxtaposition between the evocative word and the expressive quality of moving images. There's also a practice of self-quotation at work in Manhatta. For example, in scene 14, a shot taken from the front steps of Federal Hall features the facade of a building on the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street. And this echoes exactly the composition of a previous photograph taken by Paul Strand in 1916. This photograph, titled Wall Street, is identically framed and likely taken from the exact same vantage point. So what do we gain by considering creative works as a work of remix? What do we lose? What is revealed and what is obscured? What is remix? When I say remix, I could be referring to the use of a pre-existing creative expression as material in a new creative expression. Or I could be referring to what is produced as a result of using that technique. What I'd like to take up is the concept of remix as it was articulated in the late 2000s in projects such as Lawrence Lessig's book Remix, or Brett Gaylor's open source documentary, RIP a Remix Manifesto, both released in 2008. So the use of remix established it as a technique as well as an ethos about creativity, production, and consumption. In this concept, remix has its origins in hip hop, in folk music, in storytelling, and other forms of collective cultural expression. It asserts a theory of culture that stands in opposition to the corporate commodification of culture. The United States Copyright Office defines copyright as a type of intellectual property that protects original works of authorship as soon as an author fixes the work in a tangible form of expression. It's originally a device intended to protect authors by giving them exclusive right to publish and sell for a term of 14 years. It's since been extended to the life of the author plus 70 years. So for perspective, the Walt Whitman poem Manhatta first appears in the 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass. Under the copyright laws of the time, it would have been eligible to pass into the public domain in 1888. If copyright were extended by an optional term of 14 years, the latest it could have remained in copyright would have been 1902. A work created today by someone who lives for another 40 years will not enter the public domain in the United States of America until the year 2132. So, creative expressions which take the form of fixed works can be defended by copyright. In this framework, creative expressions are chiefly commodities. They're property owned by a rights holder who may or may not be the original author of the work, who is guaranteed the sole right to extract profit from the work. Remix has a different view of how culture operates, a continual circulation of shared elements. In a 2004 lecture, The Lawyer's Work in a Free Culture, Lawrence Lessig lays out the principle. Mix is the idea of taking ideas, expressions, putting them together, and making something. Remix is the practice by which others take that and re-express it. By asserting that remix predates the institution of copyright, sharing and fair use are framed as natural culture-making processes. Overzealous application of copyright is not just an infringement of individual rights or an impediment to commerce. In this framework, it is a grievous strike against the basic human activity of cultural reproduction. The circulation of expression and meanings so essential to freedom and innovation is stifled at the cost of the many for the benefit of a few. In the same lecture, Lessig goes on to make the claim that creativity and culture are all instances of remix. Culture is remix. Knowledge is remix. Politics is remix. Everyone in the life of producing and creating engages in this practice of remix. We all do it. This is what life is in the expression of creativity. Remix is how we live. I mean to insist upon all here. The logical consequence of this line of argument is taken up in Kirby Ferguson's video essay series, Everything's a Remix, which reduces creativity to the basic elements of all creativity: copy, transform, and combine. What this amounts to is the assertion of a theory of culture that is an attractive counterweight to copyright. But what else could be done? There are two considerations that suggest an opening for an expanded theory of culture, which could build on these foundations. The first is the focus of what is considered evidence of creativity. And the second is the question of how, when, and by who creativity is exercised. One of the central contentions of copyright is that creativity is about the production of fixed works which serve as commodities. A copyright can only be secured for a fixed work, a definite and sufficiently permanent form. This goes unchallenged by the logic of remix, which accepts the proposition that what is at stake are individual creative works. Remix may propose alternative structures of monopoly, different systems of regulation of use over these fixed forms, and so on. However, by leaving the creative work at the center of the consideration, Remix reduces the collective and social processes that are engaged in the production of culture to externalities that are mythologized or abstracted. Engaging with the ways that forms of culture are indebted not only to their forerunners, but to their contemporaries, highlights what is lost when copyright flattens creative effort into commodities. One of the central contentions of copyright is that there is an attributable human author. The creative work is a kind of property. The copyright is like a deed. This original rights holder can pass the copyright to other entities. At any given time, in this framework, there is only one exclusive rights holder, an individual or institution or organization. Remix lays out the possibility to challenge this contention by recognizing that creative endeavor is a cultural operation that is social in nature. However, by seeding the idea that a creative work is a kind of property, creative effort is viewed as something external to human existence. The problem is simultaneously one of granularity, as well as a narrowing of creativity down to the producer-consumer relationship. Even when the broader picture of collective culture, as in folk music or storytelling, comes into focus, it is described as a chain of transmission from producers to consumers, who may themselves become producers. This is cultural production as a collective process, but not a social one. The question of emergence as a response to human need, the role of rivalry and collaboration in production and reproduction, and the social role of participants all go unaddressed and are excluded. These are not the concerns of remix, and they are far from the concerns of copyright. However, to account for how copyright constrains culture, these considerations are necessary. What does it mean to say that creative efforts rely on shared cultural elements, or that cultural production is a collective and social process? These considerations can be addressed by building on the foundation of remix with a different emphasis, which I call recreative practice. The basic tenets of recreative practice are aligned with those of remix. The production of something novel is influenced by what has come before, and its reception is framed by our understanding of what is familiar to us. Artistic conventions and audience expectations exert influence on acts of expression. Recreative practice recognizes that the production of culture is social in nature, a process of processes. Creative expression is bounded by various pre-existing influences, conventions and expectations, forms and cultural formations, as well as the experience of previously existing creative expressions. An act of expression is shaped by the disposition and experience of its creators, their talents, skills, and aptitudes, their influences and their inspirations, their interests, concerns, and desires. It is also shaped by the community that surrounds them, the entire way of life that they are enmeshed in. These are factors that copyright disregards as externalities that are irrelevant to the creative expression that results in a fixed form. These factors are part of Remix's argument against the copyright view, but they are not the emphasis. Recreative practice decenters the creator and the fixed work to make room for a better understanding of how processes of creativity operate within the world, specifically the world of culture, as part of the always ongoing processes of curation, revision, extension, mutation, inspiration, transformation, and interpretation. The use of recreative in the term recreative practice has a dual meaning. On the one hand, recreative is the idea that this is a second creation, creating again, or creating over, or creating anew. Expression is a process of challenge and result, effort and reception, doing and undergoing. The aesthetic experience is rooted in everyday processes of how we exist in and as the world. On the other hand, there's a less obvious meaning. Recreation, as in recreational center or recreational vehicle, the action or fact of refreshing or entertaining oneself through a pleasurable or interesting pastime, amusement, activity, etc. This emphasis on play, on free production without motive of profit or utility, de-emphasizes the status of creativity as a commodity and focuses on the everyday nature of creativity. In addition, recreative practice addresses the stubborn idea that creativity is something only done by creatives, artists, producers, etc. It also seeks to address the one-way transmission from creators to audiences, a historical development contingent on cultural and technological factors. We lose sight of the fact that creativity is fundamentally bottom-up, part of the everyday, the common meanings, the product of a whole people, and occurs in individual meanings as the product of someone's whole committed personal and social experience. Creative practice is already and actively our practical consciousness. It is the intensification of an ongoing process of a specific practice of self-making, self-composition. Part of the promise of this view is the recognition that this is not a one-way transmission. Each act of creativity contributes to the overall context, shaping that context in turn. How can recreative practice expand the way we think about Manhatta? How can recreative practice help produce novel cultural experiences and creative expressions? We've touched on some of what is recreative in Manhatta. Self-quotation of photographs reenacted as motion pictures. The use of Walt Whitman's poetry, from the poem Manhatta as well as other selections from Leaves of Grass, as a framing device for brief sequences of shots loosely connected by shifting criteria such as location, framing, or subject matter. However, we can also see how recreative practice gives way to something genuinely new. Compositions are almost uniformly marked with strict adherence to the conventions of photographic composition. Camera movement is rare, product of a careful and deliberate choice. This static framing suggests the tradition of the landscape painting, or the landscape photograph. However, the contents of the frames are dynamic, seething with energy, surging crowds, swirling steam and smoke, ships cutting through dark water, streamlined trains coasting smoothly as seen from above, as well as the hulking black iron locomotive belching smoke, slowly but inexorably trundling down the track. This consistently dynamic quality transforms what would be a work of landscape photography into a new kind of motion picture portraiture, where the silent, still landscape becomes an active, articulate subject. Adherence to previous forms and the experience, training, and disposition of the filmmakers combined with the demands and affordances of a new medium to produce something that could not have been anticipated. Working in this tradition, we could envision Cinemanhatta or Auto Cinemanhatta or Finding Manhatta as drawing from contemporary experiments in digital media as a way of re-engaging the city symphony for the 21st century. So the first take on it would be Finding Manhatta. So this is inspired by Heidi Ray Cooley's Finding Augusta from 2014, specifically the accompanying Augusta app. Interactors in Finding Manhatta would be encouraged to annotate and document the locations that are featured in the 1921 Manhatta. When the app observes that you are at a location featured in Manhatta, the app notifies you. You then would have the opportunity to see the footage in AR, putting it into context with the contemporary city, as well as where it is situated and how it is used in the film Manhatta. Finally, you are invited to contribute your own take. The second phase of this project would be Cinemanhatta, a Manhatta remake. This is inspired by Perry Bard's Man with a Movie Camera global remake. This project would produce a new Manhatta set in the modern day, seeking to crowdsource or commission footage of the locations featured in Manhatta's 1921 New York City from the New York City of 2022. Crowdsourced contributions from the Finding Manhatta app would form the backbone of this project, which would feature one or more canonical cuts by a human curator, as well as offering the ability to produce Cinemanhatta cuts on their own computer or smartphone. Then the third phase of this would be Auto Manhatta. Inspired by Barbara Latanzi's repurposing of the edit patterns of avant-garde cinema as algorithms used to structure other footage. This Cinemanhatta would draw on Manhatta as an algorithm structuring a work of generative cinema. Whitman quotes would be replaced by scraped geolocative tagged tweets sent from geographic location of footage from that section of the film, matched perhaps by semantic analysis or other forms of natural language processing. Footage would be replaced by geotagged footage scraped from the web. This Auto Manhatta would be designed to run in perpetuity, ceaselessly producing iteration of Cinemanhatta, algorithmically for everyone and for no one. Umberto Eco observed that the way that artistic forms are structured reflects the way in which science or contemporary culture views reality. The way city symphonies are structured reflects something about the way in which a collaboration of two artists viewed the reality of life in the early 20th century. It spoke to me about life in the beginning of the 21st century, and it speaks to me still. These projects are imagined as ways of working together to produce a mediatic ecosystem of exchange and collaboration, constructing a community of inquiry around a set of recreative practices. Repurposing these creative works, which each wrestle with the reality of technology, culture, and creativity in light of the dominant form of our time, offers a framework for articulating what is only a nascent understanding, and provides opportunities to construct the kinds of communities of practice and celebration that are necessary for creative work to thrive. The way that forms are structured reflects the ways in which we view reality, and that principle can also be reciprocal. The way in which we view reality can be structured by our artistic forms. Just as Manhatta draws threads from the past to the future and back again to weave a mighty cable, Cinemanhatta weaves with such cables as threads to produce something neither wholly derivative nor an entirely original work, a recreation which transforms its matter, its audience, and the methods of production that shape the artistic undertaking itself.